The employees of the royal wall, who had previously proudly called out Prince Louis's name, were now merely exchanging looks when he was mentioned. What started out as a lack of attendance at formal briefings quickly evolved into something more concerning. They were deleting Louis's name, silently, purposefully, and nobody was permitted to inquire as to why. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve deeper into what this actually implies for the royal family. Initially, it was subtle. A name was absent from a list, protocol was altered, and planning materials for upcoming state visits and family appearances were changed. Once proudly listed among his siblings, Louis's name just ceased appearing. It was a pattern, slow and deliberate, a retreat from view, not a mistake. The change was chilling to those near the planning rooms. Aides who had worked at the palace for several administrations started to steer clear of mentioning the young prince directly. "We're not discussing that," or "You'll have to refer to someone else," were the short answers given when asked. However, nobody ever did. Nobody want to. Once praising the unity of William and Catherine's children, royal newspapers started oddly concentrating solely on George and Charlotte. Louis was completely left out of the section on future commitments and responsibilities in a revised family legacy document. What had been a fair story suddenly swung uncomfortably in the direction of conspicuous absence. The whispers then started. A top employee allegedly told a reporter something off the record. A choice has been made. When pressed, the phrase "something serious" was repeated several times, always in quiet tones, and always followed by a brief change of subject, even though no one sang it aloud. You'll understand after it's all finished. That same week, a private royal insider made a concerning comment. The stillness became intolerable, even within the family. Under the surface, tensions simmered. According to reports, King Charles met privately with his main group of advisors. Prince William was frequently spotted strolling away, motionless and expressionless. Rumors circulated about conflicts. Others even asserted that when William attempted to step in, those who were adamant about taking a different route resisted. The public was kept in the dark outside the palace by speeches, ceremonial hoopla, and royal appearances. However, a silent crisis had taken hold within, concealed by layers of custom and ritual. A child whose future had been thrown into the dark without any explanation was at the core of it all. It was too neat and too accurate a removal to be a coincidence. As though the future itself had been rewritten, all traces of Prince Louis from the internal projections of the monarchy had been erased. However, why? And who was really responsible for it? However, the unexpected catalyst that compelled the royal family to start covertly removing Prince Louis's destiny from the public eye would soon be exposed by one courageous insider. Even the most seasoned palace officials were shocked by what they saw in a secret memo that was sealed and concealed deep within the royal archives, according to a senior assistant. Regarding Prince Louis's place in the monarchy's destiny, the paper laid out a number of options, each more significant than the one before it. It was dated exactly half a year earlier. The words "eyes only," which were red-stamped and reserved for content intended to evade regular distribution, were displayed in the header. William had not been the intended recipient. Catherine was not even the intended recipient. However, it managed to land on a desk where it shouldn't have, and the damage it caused inside the palace was irreparable. The note was not only a memorandum. It was a clinical, dispassionate decision matrix that outlined each royal child's future responsibilities. George's statement was direct and audacious. Direct heir-complete training was started. Charlotte had a slightly more subtle box. Speaking of strategic public development, state representation, and supporting roles. Then Louis arrived, though. There was nothing in his region, not pending, not being reviewed, simply blank. William reportedly stayed motionless for about 10 minutes after eventually seeing the document through unidentified methods. Later, a staff member claimed that he left the room speechless and pale. his fists squeezed till they shook. It was like watching a man read his own son's obituary, according to a person familiar with the matter. Attention-consumed palace meetings like a vice that same week. During briefings, longtime advisors who used to laugh freely with the Prince of Wales now looked down. Agendas were condensed, decisions were taken quickly and without discussion. Rumor had it that Queen Camilla had been advocating for what she described as a reorganization of future royal representation. According to others, she thought it modernized the monarchy. Others thought it was consolidation, eliminating anything that could make the crown's future more difficult. Even greater worry was raised by legal wording concealed in the documents. Removal for cause was mentioned cryptically in one section, lines completely blacked out after that. Why would someone use such a phrase to describe a child? Why? The ramifications were terrifying. It didn't feel like planning, according to many who read it. It had the feel of a decision. There was no response from the Royal Communications Office. But in private, the quiet gave way to iciness. After officially agreeing on every choice, William and Charles started to shun one another in private encounters. There were reports of shouting from behind sealed doors. Aides made an effort to pretend nothing was amiss, but the murmurs became more intense. Something was falling apart. The future without Prince Louis was not the only thing outlined in this document. It represented a purposeful change of direction for the monarchy. And to those who were listening, it marked the start of a well-planned disappearance. Wasn't being ignored. Rather, he was being eliminated. However, there was a much more painful and intimate truth hidden below the icy ink of bureaucracy, one connected to Louis's actions, and a night that would alter everything. No official record, no statements, no cameras. But what transpired that evening inside the royal walls will never be forgotten. The pivotal moment in Prince Louis's life was an unsaid incident that was concealed by royal silence. And when they talk about it, people who saw it still shudder. The evening started off like any other private event, a low-key family supper, with no reporters or helpers present, just the royals enjoying some peace and quiet away from the spotlight. But there was a change, a tension, a stillness that descended too quickly and too forcefully. Then there was a sound. Every family member was frozen in their seats by a quick, startling outburst. As a young boy, Prince Louis erupted in what some who witnessed would later characterize as completely uncharacteristic behavior. A shout, the breaking of a glass, words that were chilling, bewildered, and terrified. At first, nobody moved, not even Catherine, who watched in disbelief as her youngest face twisted in a way that no one could explain. William was the first to respond, hurrying to soothe his kid. But it was too late. The mood broke down. The room was soon empty. Charles reportedly went without saying anything. Palace insiders said that Camilla muttered something about not doing it again. It was never made clear what that meant. The palace had already entered crisis mode by dawn. The media was not informed. There were no public calls. However, medical staff were discreetly brought in behind the scenes with tight discretion. Official records never recorded their visit. Only internal surveillance was able to record their admission, which was erased hours later. Prince Louis vanished from a planned function that same week. Then another. What was first written off as a scheduling conflict quickly became unavoidable. A trend had started. There were fewer public appearances, and when he did show up, his grin appeared practiced and distant. They were presenting a different Louis from the one the family was familiar with. Inside the palace, staff members started to whisper about that night in a respectful tone. The pause. They gave it a name, a break. Not in Louis alone, but in the whole royal system. Officially, no one was permitted to discuss it, but it hung like a rain cloud over all subsequent decisions. For days, Catherine, who had always remained calm, was observed to be clearly shaken. For about a week, William stopped going to internal briefings. The monarchy, which was accustomed to dictating its own story, was frantically trying to figure out what had just transpired and, more crucially, how to contain it. Some claim that the future was changed at this precise instant, not by order, by law, no, but by immediate, unadulterated fear. Louis had undergone a transformation, indeed. More than that, though, the royal family's desire to incorporate him into their future plans had shifted. Even while the court acted swiftly to put an end to the collapse, Louis's older siblings, particularly Princess Charlotte, were the ones who started to display the emotional toll of the royal family's most sinister secret, the princess with poise beyond her years, the one who persevered. However, as pressure increased and her brother's name receded from public life, Princess Charlotte's grin started to fade, and eventually the meticulously constructed royal image started to reveal signs of weakness. Charlotte had been heralded as the future star of the monarchy for years, steady, elegant, and emotionally astute. However, something had started to change behind the courteous curtsies and royal wave. Missed rehearsals, extended absences from school, and unusual quiet during public events were the subtle beginnings. Even before the palace acknowledged that there was a problem, those closest to her could sense it. Teachers at her prestigious private school observed unsettling conduct. Sudden outbursts, crying seclusion, and emotional crises increased in frequency, regularly. During a group assignment, Charlotte once isolated herself in a study room and repeatedly whispered. According to an instructor who wished to remain anonymous, they just ceased referring to him by name. Who she meant didn't need to be questioned. They were aware already. Catherine was at her breaking point at home. "She's carrying something she doesn't understand," she whispered as she broke down in tears during a private meeting with a royal advisor. "She must, and it's my fault." The youngster at the center of the storm was no longer the only one affected by Louis's wordless void and the weight of silence. People around him were becoming infected by it. In one terrifying moment, Charlotte's suffering was most apparent. "Why can't we talk about him?" she was heard asking in a barely audible voice during a quiet family gathering. Nobody responded to her, not even William. Like smoke, the question hovered in the room, heavy and unavoidable. In an effort to alleviate what they presented as stress connected to adjustment, the palace discreetly sent psychological personnel to both Charlotte and George. However, according to sources, the move was made more for containment than for treatment. They were afraid of what the kids would say if they were left alone. Emotion, not scandal, was the monarchy's worst weakness. Uncontrollably raw emotion. William, already divided between his responsibilities and his role as a father, grew more protective. He canceled last-minute commitments, kept his kids safe from the media, and forbade photographers from attending some events. According to those closest to him, his guilt was evident in every choice he made. He had consented to the removal, the omission, and the quiet. He was now witnessing it eat away at his daughter from the inside out. The absence of Louis's name from upcoming plans was no longer the only issue. The price of that erasure was at issue. The innocence of its youngest members was the price the royal family was paying. While the public witnessed festivities and smiles, Charlotte was the most vulnerable victim of a silent war raging beyond the palace walls. One prince became a whistleblower after he could no longer endure the weight of the cover-up, while the kids were struggling to comprehend the silence. They had spent more than 10 years working in the royal household, invisible, devoted, and trusted. However, their conscience was broken when they heard what King Charles and Camilla were planning next. Making a choice that would rock the monarchy, they risked their careers, their safety, and their silence. Being a whistleblower was never the insider's intention. They had been observing from the sidelines, snooping on secrets, and shadowing the halls of power for years. However, nothing had prepared them for the late-night talk they unintentionally overheard. Deep within Clarence's home, with the door only partially closed, Charles and Camilla had a quiet conversation. The curtain of politeness was broken by two words. Louis is being minimized. It didn't register at first. However, the implication became frighteningly obvious as the conversation progressed. Camilla argued over the monarchy's future, necessary, simplifying, and lowering uncertainty. Consequently, several aspects needed to be re-examined. She claimed that Louis had turned into a sensitive variable. Charles remained silent. He only gave a nod. The assistant realized they weren't talking about discipline at that point. They were talking about erasure. Driven by a mix of duty and terror, the insider utilized an open app on a nearby scheduling device to make a duplicate of the meeting's audio that had been inadvertently recorded. The words were clear, even though the quality wasn't flawless. Camilla had stated, "We must make sure he doesn't complicate things going forward." "It's already in motion," Charles retorted. The walls started to close in within a few days. Unusual behavior in their personnel file was observed by the insider, an unplanned performance evaluation, ambiguous remarks on alignment and allegiance. Subtle threats followed. They were cornered in the corridor by a senior palace official who warned them to be careful. Here, not everyone who disobeys survives. Fearful but determined, the insider contacted a reputable royal historian, one of the few reliable sources. Throughout the public and private spheres, they convened behind closed doors, in a rural manor that was said to have once held other royal secrets, far from London. The audio was played there. Silently, the historian said, "This changes everything." Now the plan seemed obvious. Louis's removal had been planned, not decided on the spur of the moment or out of anxiety. Strategized and managed. It's to defend something else, not Louis. There is a deeper reality, a fissure in the royal image that, if revealed, has the potential to overthrow more than a succession plan. The insider submitted one last anonymous statement to a reliable journalist before completely vanishing from public life. Louis isn't the only one. It has to do with what they are concealing. And when the populace started to ask questions, King Charles himself took a cold, calculating step to permanently seal Louis's doom. It was secretly signed. Not a single camera, not a ceremony. However, the ramifications were profound. Thank you. King Charles approved a secret royal edict with the express intent of excluding Prince Louis from all contingency planning pertaining to succession. This was no longer conjecture. It was authentic. The document was drafted and reviewed in complete secrecy, yet it was sealed with the monarch's personal seal. Neither official correspondence nor public records mentioned it. Rather, it moved discreetly throughout the royal administration's highest echelons. At its heart is a single directive, with instant effect. Prince Louis would no longer be involved in any preparations for diplomatic representation, constitutional succession, or ceremonial events pertaining to the monarchy's continuation. The approval procedure was both eerie and covert. Queen Camilla, who is said to have played a major role in the decision, gave her approval without hesitation. Prince Edward nodded in silent resignation. However, the most powerful message and implicit support for the monarchy came from Princess Anne's silent consent. Despite her reputation for staunch independence throughout her life, a choice was taken. They had made the decision to conform with whatever they knew or thought. But William didn't. Not initially. He resisted the decree vehemently behind closed doors. He maintained that Louis was still a child, still developing, and yet innocent, according to sources. However, William finally gave in to increasing pressure, and a father who was determined to defend the institution at all means. Some claim that his hands were shaking when he signed the acknowledgement page. Some claim that he avoided making eye contact with his father. Louis's removal became an administrative reality after that. State paperwork drafts, protocol matrices for significant forthcoming royal occasions, and diplomatic travel rosters all subtly removed his name. Engagements for the future were rearranged. Aides were told to conceal the underlying motivation beneath a facade of modernism by using words like streamlining representation or adjusted visibility. Few people paid attention to the palace's brief public announcement of redefining the roles of the next generation in a changing monarchy. It was refined and ambiguous. Those 6 words, realigning the next generation's roles, were a coded confirmation of what had been done in the halls of power, despite their seeming calmness. The Prince and Princess of Wales's youngest son had been officially excluded from the royal line. What many feared was confirmed behind closed doors by individuals who had access to the complete directive. Charles had defended the action by saying it would protect the monarchy from instability. It was strategic foresight, he said. Critics, however, saw something completely different. The start of a monarchy that had opted for exclusion over empathy and secrecy over support. However, Catherine started to fall apart as Charles tightened his hold on the crown story, plagued by secrets, shame, and the suffering of a mother. She had persevered in the face of pressure, illness, and controversy. However, nothing could have prepared Catherine for the anguish of witnessing her son's disappearance from history while he was mute. Her battle became hushed, then dangerously loud, behind the palace doors. She had obeyed with pride for months. As Louis's name vanished from records, plans, and futures, she had grinned during the ceremonies, posed for pictures, and made measured public remarks. However, something inside her snapped when the royal edict came to pass. According to family sources, Catherine and King Charles had a private altercation that left everyone in the room speechless. She showed in without warning, holding a folder of private letters, and begged that the ruling be overturned. One assistant called what happened next devastating. Charles did not bend, but he listened. All he said when he did speak was, "This is bigger than any one of us." Catherine didn't go quietly. She cautioned them, informed them that more than just a legacy was being destroyed. They were tearing up a family. However, just like her son's presence, her voice was silenced. Her subsequent attempts to discreetly restore Louis's position were thwarted by palace officials. They addressed her with well-chosen words that were both courteous and firm enough to refuse. "Ma'am, it's too late. The wheels are turning." Over the next few weeks, Catherine started to withdraw. Her dazzling public persona faded. She resigned from a number of important royal responsibilities without giving a reason. When she did show up, she had a reserved manner and fairish eyes. She left early, citing illness, to attend charity obligations. However, insiders claim that she sobbed just before taking the stage, telling her staff in a whisper, "I can't keep pretending he's not there." When a trustworthy member of the house staff discreetly found a discarded journal thought to be hers, it was established that she was truly in pain. Confessional letters that were never sent were included. They were addressed to William, Louis, and tragically, to herself. "I should have protected you harder," was one of the lines. "I ought to have fought more vocally." "I will never forgive myself for what I allowed them to do," stated another. Her marriage was torn apart by the strain. Already overburdened by his responsibilities, William was now torn between his wife's demands for justice and his father's demands for silence. He reportedly slept in a different wing for a number of nights while he tried to make sense of the man he had become and the vows he had given to his kid. The recording then started. It recorded Catherine's voice during a heated call, probably with a top royal assistant, and was leaked via an internal palace device. She spoke in a cracked, tremulous, but unwavering voice. "I am aware of his potential," she remarked, "and I understand his motivation. However, I won't remain silent indefinitely." That one sentence rekindled long-forgotten discussions. There was a spike in speculation. Was Catherine implying something profound, deeper, something that was hidden from the world by the monarchy. And just when it appeared that Louis would be forgotten, an unexpected set of events rekindled public interest and transformed soft murmurs into loud demands. Even though it was brief, it was sufficient to disrupt the internet. After being suppressed for months, a never-before-seen video of Prince Louis appeared online. Instead of scandal, the video showed something much more tragic and real. It started off as a discreet leak on a specialized royal forum. A blurry, unedited clip showed up without any background. It swept across platforms like wildfire in a matter of hours. Louis may be seen in the corner of a tiny, private event in the video. He wasn't acting badly. He wasn't rebellious. He was shattering. He wailed hysterically, his tiny figure quivering, his sobs muffled only by the fact that no one moved to console him. His anguish seemed to have been practiced into stillness. The world responded immediately. This was not the picture of a troubled youngster or a disobedient prince. It depicted a young man who had experienced emotional abandonment, loneliness, and involvement in a power struggle that he had not requested. After months of watching Louis vanish from sight, the public was finally getting a close-up look at what that disappearance looked like. They were appalled. Hashtags exploded on social media. Number let him be heard. Number where is Louis? Number justice for Louis. The palace's standard tactic, deflection and silence, failed to keep up with the intensifying tempest. The video was picked up by several media outlets. Answers were required by international headlines. Why was this kept a secret? How has Prince Louis been affected by the palace? To what extent will the monarchy go to preserve its reputation? Then Catherine made her first public appearance in weeks at a children's mental health organization. She appeared noticeably frail when she arrived, and she remained silent when questioned about Louis. However, while the cameras rolled, she turned away and wiped her cheek. The crisis was characterized by that one moment: a mother, quiet, a family at battle with themselves, a child deleted. Finally, under increasing pressure, William spoke up. However, he spoke too cautiously. "We are handling things discreetly and compassionately." He made a succinct statement. However, it was insufficient to the general population. They didn't want compassion. They desired responsibility. They desired the truth. Above all, they desired Louis. Over 1 million signatures were added to the petitions. "He's still a royal." Protesters held signs as they emerged outside the palace gates. "And return Louis." Royal press teams hurried to take back command of the story. However, the momentum had changed. The monarchy could no longer ignore this story. There was a movement here. However, the most explosive truth remained kept deep within the royal walls, despite the public's demands for answers. A dossier that was never supposed to come to light. A file that was going to reveal the darkest side of the whole story. One that included motives in addition to names and dates. However, the truth of the choice remained hidden despite the growing public sympathy, up until the discovery of a secret royal dossier. The document was supposed to remain concealed forever, but it was discovered buried in a locked cabinet. Pages of internal memos, psychiatric evaluations, and a concluding letter from King Charles outlining the reasons Prince Louis could never be included were all published, before a routine refurbishment uncovered what would turn out to be the most incriminating revelation of the entire story. The unnoticed cabinet in a distant wing of the castle had been walled up and forgotten for a long time. A file with only Louis's initials was hidden behind official letters and decrees that had been stored. There was no treachery or scandal waiting inside. It was terror, clinical and icy, fear in institutions. The first pages were evaluations, assessments of Louis that went beyond typical pediatric reports, but were carried out under the pretense of regular developmental checkups. They alluded to increased emotional sensitivity, abnormal behavior, and what one physician described as a propensity for instability under duress. The assessments were noted for what the child potentially signified to the crown rather than out of concern for the youngster. One counselor wrote bluntly and underlinedly, Unpredictability equals liability. The memo that follows was written by King Charles himself and was never intended for general consumption. He exposed the inner calculus of power in it. He wrote, "Even if it costs us everything, even them, we protect the institution." The connotation was clear, even if the "they" was never identified. Fearing that one infant could upend decades of authority, Louis had been weighed, measured, and discreetly taken away. Handwritten remarks in the paper margins were another emotional strand in the dossier. They were Catherine's. She wrote, "He was terrified, not dangerous." In one section next to the phrase emotionally unpredictable. He's merely attempting to get noticed in another, which is highlighted 3 times. Missing from official remarks, her voice screamed from the page, attempting to humanize the boy whose very ancestry had made him a menace. Then William's mark appeared. One sheet featured his signature next to a handwritten note that said, "I had no choice." There was no date on it. No explanation was given. It said, however, everything. One of the future's most fragile parts has ultimately been signed away by the man tasked with safeguarding it. His devotion to the throne had overshadowed his paternal responsibilities. Even Princess Anne's influence, which was previously believed to be neutral, was evident. She had highlighted words and written, "This will break him," in multiple parts. A silent caution, a murmur amidst the thunderous machinery of the monarchy. However, nobody paid attention. Nobody intervened. The dossier's last page was the shortest. One sentence, no formatting, no heading, unsigned, and undated. In the middle of the sheet, there was only one silent, terrible fact printed. He's only a boy yet. One thing has emerged as the monarchy tries to manage the consequences. The issue was never Prince Louis. The cost was him. The world now seeks justice. I appreciate you watching. Remember to subscribe and like, and we'll see you in the next one.